to Rome. And so God has a way. By the way that God leads in our lives, have you ever thought about how distinct it is? I mean, sometimes it's like God wrote it in the sky, or God sent you a letter. All right, you can look back sometimes and see the hand of God leading all through. Now there are there are times in your life when you can't see every little detail, but God gives us enough of a look to see why this happened, or draw that conclusion, or why that happened. I don't know, I've gone through this, well, how I wound up meeting my wife, how we wound up coming to Fountain, I've rehearsed that in my mind many times, and I'm sure y'all have too. Well, God knows what he's doing. So he knew right where Paul was, and he was working. He had some preaching for Paul to do along the way. He had a king named Agrippa for him to talk to. He had a Festus and a Felix, and had some people along with him that were fellow prisoners to talk to. Now, those are just thoughts to throw out, but he was on track, and even though the people didn't want him to go, Paul said, I got to go, I'm going. So he insisted on going to Jerusalem. Now, verse 14, when he would not be persuaded, we ceased, saying, the will of the Lord be done. We ought to learn from that sometimes. Have you ever been talking to somebody about some spiritual issue and you just knew you were right? Now, we're not talking about something doctrinal. We're talking about an opinion over what they ought to do. Generally speaking, most of us have an opinion about what everybody else ought to do, and we're real good at managing their lives. Not so good at ours, but good at managing other people. And lots of times people are just real vocal about what so-and-so ought to do. If y'all just asked me, I've probably got an opinion about everything, you know. Somebody told me one time, they said, you really have a lot of opinions. And my response, it's just that arguing way about me. I said, so do you. All right? And of course, I could have gone a step further and say mine right and yours wrong, you know. That's the way we think, isn't it? Now, that's not really true. Mine are sometimes wrong. But just give it to God. We've heard that several times here lately in different contexts. Somebody said, we're just giving that to the Lord. Well, they just gave that to the Lord. They thought, what can we do? We can't do without Paul. We need this man. He goes to Jerusalem. They're going to kill him. But God was still God. After those days, we took up our carriages and went up to Jerusalem. There went with us also certain of the disciples of Caesarea, and brought with them one Naasson of Cyprus, an old disciple with whom we should lodge. When we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. Now, just observation, I can't guarantee this, and I know it involves a little speculation, but I don't think it involves much. I believe if you'd have been there, you would have felt an attitude of anticipation. They were expecting something. They didn't know what was ahead, but they had anticipation of something. I think there was some fear. The day following, Paul went in with us unto James, and he's the pastor, and all the elders were present. And when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. So he gave them what we would call today a missionary report. He just brought them up to date on what had happened. And it was not in the sense of informing people just for information's sake. He was praising the Lord for what God had done amongst the Gentiles. He was undoubtedly very thankful. He was probably passionate, full of energy, is excited. When they heard it, they glorified the Lord, and said unto him, thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. Now, think about the placement of that statement. He just told all these Gentiles have been saved. And then they said, you see how many thousands of Jews there are which believe. they still had, now I realize he went somewhere with this, but they still had this in their head that because they were Jews, they had a special dispensation, so to speak, or a special blessing from God. Yes, but y'all, when you get to heaven, you're saved. There won't be just Jews and Gentiles. There'll just be saved folks. And we are all one in the Lord. And God's not done with the Jews yet. And we know that God's not done with the Jews yet. God's still going to work with Israel. It's a wonderful thing to be a Jew. I feel like Brother Terry, we pick on him some. He's our resident Jew. I don't know what we'd do without Brother Terry to pick on. But he is blessed to be Jewish. And, I really think that there ought to be some honor there. But on the other hand, he gets saved the same way we do. And God is, what's that expression that we keep repeating? No respecter of persons. All right, so they say, there's thousands of Jews which believe, and they're all zealous of the law. And they are informed of thee that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses. Now, I wonder who told them that. You remember those Jews that kind of dogged Paul all along in his missionary work? There were people that just wanted to stop that work. They wanted to stop his work with those Gentiles. They really wanted, I believe they were tools of the devil, and they really wanted to stop God's work altogether. And they probably went around with a halo, so to speak. They looked like they were sheep, but they really were wolves. And so they kept spreading this around. And they were a thorn in not only Paul's side, but that ministry side. And so this was something Paul had to deal with. They are informed of thee that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, which was not so, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. So they were critical, and they were full of prejudice, and they was being dishonest. That was just some of them, but you know how that can be. The Bible says where there's envying and strife is, there's confusion and every evil work. What is it therefore? The multitude must needs come together. And that was wisdom. I mean, they had to settle this because they had all this that had been said about Paul's ministry. For they will hear that thou art come. So when they kept saying it wasn't James and those other elders in the church. It was this crowd that had been influenced falsely to think ill of Paul and his ministry. Do therefore this that we say to thee. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. Them take and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing. But that thou thyself also walkest orderly and keepest the law. So this was their decision, this was their request, I should say, that Paul do this to prove that he was still faithful to the law and he had not distorted anything in the ministry of the gospel. Then verse 25 is, touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. So what it amounted to was Paul was instructed to prove himself. Now, by the way, if you're ever in a position like that, which you probably will be as a Christian, you can get aggravated about that. You know, I have to tell you, this is pretty selfish, but it seems like most everything we do, we've been doing a long time. And even after having been here so long, you know, we still have to reestablish our credibility all the time. Because there's people ask you questions. They'll ask you, you know, they're checking you out to see if you're real. You just get used to that. That's what happens. It's not always easy. We've been doing our work that we do for a long time, and some time back I got kind of blindsided by somebody. I didn't know him. He'd walked across and solicited wanted our work, and we'd been working for his neighbor, and he came across the street. He was real friendly and everything, and next thing I know, he was on our book. He was on the schedule. And then about 2 or 3 weeks later, I got this call, and this was what he said. He said, I've hired you to work for me, but I don't know you. And he said, I need all, and he started asking all kinds of things. And he said, if I don't get this by the end of the day, you're not going to work for me. And I thought, yeah, you know what my reaction was? I don't care whether I work for you or not. Y'all understand? I mean, that was my immediate response. Well, I didn't respond like you think I would have. What I did is I answered him, and I was kind, and then I said at the end, I want you to know at this stage in the game, I've been doing this a long time, I'm not used to this kind of treatment. And I just left it at that. And he just happened to have called today and said, how soon can we get together? So anyway, when it comes to the Lord, the devil's going to have somebody stirred up at you. Every time you turn around, he's going to think that you're whatever. You're a disappointment. Just don't let it get you goat. All right? Be careful. As a Christian, if you do, there's more at stake than just your hurt feelings or something like that. You got to realize you're dealing with souls here. By the way, in my case, because it's me, it's my life, I have to remember that in our work. Everybody knows who we are when we show up on a job. I can't divorce myself from the pulpit just when I get out of this church and go out here in the world. I'm the same person all the time, and they all know I'm a preacher, and they all know the boys are Christians. And so anyway, so just remember, when somebody questions you, don't get angry. He had to prove himself. Here was Paul proving himself. What is it, therefore? The multitude must needs come together. And so, anyway, they was going to come together. He had to prove himself. Now, verse 26. Then Paul took the men the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. When the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him. Now, if you'd have been Paul's friends and you saw him lay hands on, now, all you security folks here at the church, this was a violent age in those days. I mean, they did things to people that were terrible. Those coliseums were not for football. Many of the people, we've heard how many times about all the things that were done in the name of religion that had nothing to do with goodness. Well, that's the truth. It's been like that a long time. Well, now, these Jews saw him in the temple, and they stirred up the people, and you can be sure they stirred them up with a lie, a bunch of lies, and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help!" Can you just hear it? This is the man, here's little Paul, that teacheth all men everywhere against the people, that is, against the Jew, and the law, and this place. Now, Paul had just come a long way to come there to worship. So, in Paul's heart, he could have been very indignant. I teach the people against this place? No. Is he teaching against the law? No. And further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place. That all was a lie. They had taken things that they thought were evidence But y'all, if somebody hates you enough, you don't have to have evidence. They can make up things. We see that all around us anymore. You know, if people can't find something, they just kind of come up with something. And so they did that to Paul. For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. Why did they suppose that? Because they wanted to believe something bad about this guy. He was a creep. They hated him. They hated what he stood for. By the way, don't forget why they hated him so. They hated him certainly because he was identified with the Lord Jesus Christ. They hated him because he preached, and his preaching, which was of God, pointed out their emptiness and the vanity of where they were in their religion. And so it was very convicting, and it exposed them, and they didn't want to be exposed. They were used to people practically worshiping them. They were very proud people. All the city was moved, and the people ran together. There was much anger in those days. We're living in a time that's growing increasingly angry. Well, this was an angry time. The people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. So they shut the door, and boy, they were going to work him over. They was going to tear him apart. Now, as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band. That's a Roman soldier, see? That all Jerusalem was in an uproar. He was in charge of the whole area. And so he would have been the local law enforcement. And he got word. He was responsible for what went on in his jurisdiction. Who immediately took soldiers and centurions. Now you got a centurion, one centurion, you got 100 men. So this is centurions plural. So he had soldiers and centurions and ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain of the soldiers, here's all this mob. They've been beating on Paul, and they saw them coming, and guess what happened? They quit. They left beating of Paul. You know, you have to say something about this. When you read later in Paul's letters, all the different things that happened to him in his life, it's an amazing thing. It's a miracle that Paul had survived this long. Because he had been stoned, he had been beaten, and we're not talking about stoned just once or twice. He'd been beaten many times. 39 stripes with a cat of nine tails kill most people. He had really had some tough times. Remember, he had been left for dead. They actually, one place, he was beaten, and they drug him out of town, and everybody was gathered around him, and they was grieving over him, and he just gets up and walks back into town. You gotta admire him. He's no John Wayne as far as size, but he had more heart than John did, because it was his heart